Hey guys, today I want to talk about the minimum skills required to get a software engineering position as fast as possible. If you're new to this channel, my name is Alex Lee and I'm a senior software engineer based in New York City. I started my coding journey back in 2014 by attending a coding bootcamp school. In this channel, I not only do coding tutorials on various different technologies, but I also create content to help aspiring developers become software engineers. If topics like this interest you, I highly recommend hitting that subscribe button. Before we start talking about the minimum skills required for you to get that first coveted engineering position, I want to talk about the three categories most developers fall into when joining a company. The first category is the front-end developer, also known as the UI/UX engineer. This does not necessarily mean that you're going to be a designer, but you're going to be responsible for the front end of the application and how you want to display the data to the user. In the earlier days, you would have to know JavaScript and jQuery to handle DOM events, but these days, knowing JavaScript and some kind of front-end framework like React, Vue, or Angular will suffice. The second category is the back-end developer. The back-end developer will be responsible for managing your data and how it's saved. Generally, the skills you will need to become a back-end developer is to know some kind of database language and some back-end framework. Generally, as a back-end developer, you'll have to know some relational database like MySQL or Postgres and some back-end framework like Node, Ruby on Rails, or Laravel. The last category is the full-stack developer, and that's considered the unicorn of the three categories where you do both front-end and back-end development. From my experience so far, the full-stack developer is less common, and that's because both front-end and back-end technologies have advanced significantly in their respective fields. So it's really hard to be an expert in both front-end and back-end development, but it's very possible. So why am I talking about these three categories? A lot of people I talk to who are interested in learning how to code with the intention of changing their careers have a track to become full-stack developers. And don't get me wrong, I believe that this is a very aspiring goal and it's very achievable, but it's very hard to do when you're first starting to learn how to code. Remember, what we're trying to do here is land you your first job. Whether you do 100% front end or 100% back end, it doesn't really matter. As long as you get your first position, it really gives you an opportunity to grow exponentially. Trying to do that full stack route can, like I said, could lead to information overload, and it could be more of a detriment than a positive to absorb all that information. So what is my recommendation in landing you your first job? Focus on the front end. If anything, I will put 90% focus on the front end and 10% into the back. The reason why I recommend front end over back end is that it's a little bit easier to grasp and get that visual and UI feedback based on the code changes that you make. Unfortunately, in the back end, you have to know some kind of relational database, and on top of that, you're trying to learn a coding language plus some kind of back-end framework. And like I said before, that information overload can be more of a detriment than a positive. In terms of the back end, I will put about 10% effort to get a high-level understanding of what back-end developers do. I would recommend a more passive learning approach, and what I mean by that is I don't want you to actually be coding, but instead just grabbing a book about relational databases and a backend framework and language like Ruby and Ruby on Rails or like Python. If you ever need to take a break from your front-end coding sessions, this is a great opportunity for you to open up that book and just read about how backend technologies work. Remember, we're not trying to get you your first job as a full-stack developer. We're just trying to get you a first job as a software engineer. I know some companies like to differentiate on their job posting that they're looking for front-end developers and your title will be a front-end developer. But generally, most companies, from what I've seen, just generalize it by calling them software engineers. All right, now to the front end. Let's break down the essential skills needed for you to become a software engineer. First is HTML. 2 is CSS and SASS, 3 is JavaScript, and 4 is a front-end framework like React, Vue, or Angular. In my recommendation, based on the popularity of developers, I would highly recommend React. And the last thing I would recommend is learning Git and GitHub along the way. I'll provide some links about each one in the description below, but generally HTML, CSS, and SASS are used to build the layout of your application. With HTML, CSS, and SASS, you can essentially build your own website, but it's going to be static. To really get your applications to come to life, you're going to have to know JavaScript. When you first start learning how to code, you're going to be bombarded with all these different coding languages: C#, C, Java, Python, I would just ignore all of that and just focus on JavaScript, because JavaScript is the go-to language for building front-end applications. What I want to emphasize is that once you learn one coding language very well, it's very easy for you to learn the next language pretty quickly. So instead of trying to learn all these nuances with these different languages, just focus on JavaScript, and eventually learning a new language will be second nature to you once you get more comfortable with it. Learning JavaScript is the equivalent of learning the alphabet, so you can write, so you can read, and chat with your friends. If you don't get a good grasp of JavaScript, it's going to be tough for you as a front-end developer. Did I mention how important JavaScript is? All right, so now that you know JavaScript, the next thing I recommend learning is React. React is a popular front-end framework created by Facebook that's used by a large number of companies, small and big, like Airbnb, Uber, and Netflix. You can think of React as a wrapper or an abstraction layer around JavaScript to help build your applications easier, make it more digestible and scalable. By learning React, you'll be inherently learning HTML, CSS, SASS, and JavaScript. Another way to think about the relationship between JavaScript and React is to imagine creating a blueprint. You can create a blueprint using a software application or doing it by hand. Obviously, when you do it by hand, it's going to take a lot more time. It takes a lot more intricacies. But maybe when you use a software, you can take advantage of the shortcuts, the ability to draw straight lines easier, the ability to add dimensions quicker. In this example, using the software to build that blueprint is the equivalent of React to building that front-end application. Regardless of doing it by software or by hand, you still have to have some kind of inherent knowledge of how blueprints work, how dimensions work, and that is the equivalent of knowing JavaScript. Without knowing JavaScript, you can't really use React to its fullest potential. And similar to the example that I just described, without having a good understanding of architecture, you're not going to be able to create a great blueprint. One thing I would recommend when you're transitioning from JavaScript to React is to do it faster than later. I know you want to make sure that I understand 100% JavaScript before moving to React, but the beauty of learning React is that you're inherently going to be using JavaScript anyways, so it's a good way to practice both. The last thing I want to mention along the way of learning those essential skills is to learn Git and Github. Git is an open source version control system that lets you save your code changes. Imagine creating a Word document, and every time you want to save, you actually use save as instead of save. What exactly happens? You're going to have a history of all your Word documents depending on the changes that you made on that specific document. Git is similar in that way in a sense that it's going to create a history of all the changes that you made. This is really good for developers because there could be times where you make mistakes along the way and you could revert back to your old changes in case that actually happens. If you were to always override your original file, then it's going to be really hard to debug what specific code caused that error. Git is highly powerful and I highly recommend using it. All companies use some version of Git, so it's going to be an essential skill that you need to know to be able to collaborate with your teammates. Speaking of collaboration, I want to talk about GitHub, which is kind of a piggyback off Git. GitHub allows you to share your commit history online with other developers. You need to be able to share your code with your coworkers, and Git is only a localized version to your computer. All right, to recap, to get that first engineering position, I will put 90% effort into the front end and 10% into the back. In the front end, you should always be actively coding, but in the back end, you can do more of a passive learning approach by reading a book or just reading a couple of blogs. The front end focus should be HTML, CSS, SASS, JavaScript, and React. The time you would normally spend to become a full stack developer and learning that back end technology should be replaced with putting more emphasis into the HTML and the CSS, SASS. I've been around a lot of brilliant back end developers who don't want to do front-end development, not because of JavaScript, but because of CSS and SASS. CSS and SASS is super important when working on front-end development, and if you can be a guru in that aspect, you're going to be highly sought after because it's one of those underappreciated skills, but necessary skills for you to really give your application some life, some view, and some color. With this focus of putting 90% effort into the front end, your selling point to prospective employers is that you are a developer with strong JavaScript skills, CSS skills, and you know a front-end framework like React. Remember, we're not trying to get you to become a full stack developer, but land you your first job. But the one thing I want to emphasize is that although this strategy is more towards you getting a front-end engineering position, once you do get that job, I wouldn't get complacent. Spend about a year and a half doing front-end development, and at that point, I would talk to your boss about potential opportunities to learn back-end technologies. At that point, you probably create a good repertoire with your boss that you can easily have these kind of conversations. The major difference between the scenario that I just described and what it was before is that you already have a job. You're getting paid to learn, but before you're trying to cram everything before you even get the job and you don't even know what kind of work you're going to be doing. So why not get paid, bring value to the company, but also learn new technologies on the way? I think this is a win-win for both you and your company. I hope this was helpful for you, and if it was, I would appreciate that thumbs up. If you have any questions, please add them in the comments below. If you have any specific questions for you and your coding journey, you can always contact me for a consultation, and my email is in the description. Until then, Tech Rally out.